Yes, right, we're live now. Hello, internet.
Hey, internet.
Hello.
Internet? No, it's not allowed to swear on the internet. That's like the internet law.
Zaidro, লিংকটা দিও
হ্যাঁ, লিংকটা দেবো। আচ্ছা, আমার গাবে কারা, রামেশা and সরদীপ ভাই, অপে, আরশি and Nawal, আর অপে হচ্ছে আরশি, আফনান and
Shabab.
Oh, Shabab is debating.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Go ahead.
Without further ado, I call upon the Prime Minister to open the constructive case from the proposition side. Here. Oh, shit. What a beginning.
Yeah. Acha. 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, when a faulty allele defines my life, becomes the most important and yet the most uncomfortable part of my identity, we believe that I as an individual have a right to sacrifice that life, but moreover, I believe that my mother can take that decision to not give birth to me anyways. Because we as High Proposition believe in one stance, right? That in this scenario, when a life of an individual is bound to be so horrible, we think that no life is still better than that significantly horrible life that we propagate. What do we mean when we say that hereditary diseases? We think hereditary diseases are inherited diseases that you inherit from your parents, but rather those effects are visible starting from your childhood, and they end up ruining your childhood and subsequently your adult life if you survive your childhood. Right? What principal burdens do we put in space? First, we'll tell you why under our word, the right to reproduction is only applicable in certain cases and only certain contexts. But secondly, and more importantly, we believe that the life of this individual who will be inheriting this disease is going to be so horrible and so dreadful that we'd rather not have this life at all, no matter what happens if that individual had that particular life. Now, let's first understand why I as a mother or I as a father, if I have an hereditary disease in my line of in my generation line, why do I not have this right to reproduce? Because we think that the right to reproduce is not absolute, i.e., we recognize the value of the right to reproduction. We recognize that individuals might want to start a family and that they are free to choose whether or not they can do so. We think that when it is used to that particular end, when it's used as that particular instrument, we think that that kind of right is something that you can always exercise. But the problem in the time when you as an individual know that your offspring is going to inherit diseases that are inherently going to make their life a living hell, we believe in that situation, you do not have the right to make that decision for the individual anymore. Because we think that the moment in time when you make that call of giving birth to that individual, giving birth to that child, to that infant, you inherently make the call that that individual is going to live a horrible life, and that the consequences that they are going to suffer for it are inherently because of your faulty gene or your faulty genetic code. We think that in those circumstances, you cannot take that risk that, we cannot take that risk that, let's assume that in a probabilistic scale, this person's life might be something that's inherently better. We think that you cannot take that risk primarily because the probability that your child's life is going to be a life filled with weeks of going to the hospital for inherent blood transfusions is something that you as an individual think that you cannot take the decision. In conclusion, we think that this site in this particular context, in this particular scenario, should be compromised. So the second idea, that ultimately, to what extent does a hereditary disease like sickle cell anemia or hemochromatosis affect the infant that is going to be born, affects the child that is going to be grown up, affects the adult that this individual might become? We think that the moment in time when an individual has sickle cell anemia or cystic fibrosis is the moment in which this individual suffers inherent problems, right? first of all, this person suffers biologically, i.e. this person has to go to hospitals for blood transfusion every single week. But secondly, more importantly, this person is drained out of life, as this individual does not have that energy and that capacity to do things that his peers or that his friends can do. But secondly, this individual and their social interactions significantly decrease, right? Because we think that the moment in time when this individual, someone who is inherently cursed by a disease, and when this individual goes to class parties or galas or socials, is the moment in time when every single person around them pities this individual, right? They think that they consider this individual as a different species entirely, simply because they've been marred and scarred by a disease that they didn't inherently choose to be ill, right? We think that the moment in time when they're pitied by individuals, when they're looked down by their peers, by their seniors, and every single one, that is the moment in time in which these individuals these individuals start to doubt themselves, but rather their mental health is something that is inherently compromised and that is inherently deteriorate in this case. How does their mental health, how do they mentally get crippled? In three ways, right? First, we think that they are no longer socially able to communicate because they think that they are outsiders. It's simply because they have been marred by a disease. They don't think that they can hang out with their friends as frequently as they can. They think that they are a burden to these individuals think that they are a burden to their own parents, as financially and mentally they are draining every single penny out of their parents. Right? Secondly, we think that the moment in time when they don't get to interact with people, when they are isolated, is a moment in time when these individuals and their self-esteem is significantly lowered, where they feel that they are inherently inferior to everyone else simply because they in and of itself cannot properly interact with anyone else, cannot have friends, and cannot share their ideas and their thoughts about the world with someone else. Right? But lastly, we think that it affects them in adults' life as well if they survive their childhood, which has already been ruined by an increasingly crippled mental state. Right? We think that the moment in time where they're looked upon, if they make it out to their adult life, is when they have an extreme low amount of self-confidence, where they cannot anywhere in whatsoever make the decisions for themselves. They're inherently reliant on other individuals, and they're constantly emotionally highly unstable. We think that in a life, in these cases, in these situations, when you are inherently called a grenade, when you can explode at any time, when you must be hospitalized at any time in this situation, is the moment in time when you can no longer be happy. As the moment in time when you lose any sort of chance or any sort of that glimmer of hope that you can have fulfillment in your life, when you're constantly stuck, where you have constantly tube stuck in your nose. We think that the moment in time when this particular biological disease it inherently affects them and defines them is the moment in time we tell you that their life is no longer worth living. We think that because their life is no longer worth living, they do not inherently deserve such a horrible life.
Time's up.
We think, right? The burden of opposition is to show you why this individual, even if it's a horrible life, it's still a much better life than any life given whatsoever. Very proud to propose.
Yeah.
Hey, 7 minutes speech hoche.
Yeah. By the way, just asking, is there a reply speech or not?
No reply speech. Acha guys, POIs কিন্তু আছে হ্যাঁ
Alright, মানে ওরা তুলে না এটা তো
হ্যাঁ মানে তুইলো I thank the Prime Minister for her speech. I call upon the Leader of Opposition to open the case from the opposition side. Here.
সরি আমি আমার কল আনমিউট করতে পারতেছিলাম না ওকে রেডি শোনা যায়
হ্যাঁ শোনা যায়
গাইস শোনা
হ্যাঁ শোনা যায়
one thing last debate কে জিস লাফট অন যে রাজ করছে
গাভ মানে সাকিব গাভরা ওকে সো starting 3 2 1 The burden of our side is not to prove to you that the life, that horrible life that they paint is a life worth living. We think the burden from our side is to prove to you why happiness is not the only absolute form of happiness that they see from their side of the world, and how you cannot see into the lives of these people if you have that sort of mentality to begin with. My rebuttals are going to be integrated into my speech. I'll point them out. specifically. The first thing is just in terms of probability, this means that these inherent diseases are not always going to constantly happen, which means that there's this chance that a child might be born without this disease to begin with. But secondly, in terms of diseases, it could be of two types, right? So the first thing that we think is important in this debate is the right to consent, where in their world, they're devaluing these individuals to a large extent and leaving that choice up to the parents, even when they're old and these people gain adulthood. So this could be in two processes. One, it's a physical disease where this person has a mental capability to decide whether or not he wants a child to begin with, because say for his physicality or all of those reasons, he's already been suppressed by society, has faced all the problems that they talk about. If that person is indeed that depressed, he already has a logical understanding to understand that he probably does not want the kid anyway and already needs to sterilize it. If that person is someone who's mentally unstable or mentally has a disease, we don't think that those people have the same needs as a normal individual to begin with. That means that one, that means that that person probably might not want kids and doesn't have those needs. But we think even if that person does, I'm going to show to you why that form of depression that you paint from your side is not inherently as bad as you say it is. Two rebuttals. One, why from their side they assume that that person is going to live an absolutely horrible life, will not be able to have social interactions, and won't be able to make friends and break into their circles. We think that one, happiness is relative. Also, social interactions themselves are relative as well, which means that when you have social interactions, you only form friends with your own circles, that is the people you meet. So even in the worst case scenario, say this is a person who has a mental disability and is stuck to his bed and cannot move from his bed, we think his social circle revolves around the parents that he has, the brothers, sisters, and the people that come to meet him, which means from their side, this person is not someone who constantly goes to school and gets badgered for being that disabled. But even if that person is, he still has his own circles to begin with. We don't think that, you know what, you want to be friends with these people who don't want to be, we don't think that they paint these circles to be something that is realistic in nature. And in terms of happiness, so a good example of this is if this person from their side, I'll take you in a minute, if this person from their side wants to play cricket and they're saying that this person has this disability that won't allow him to play cricket, we think that at the point in time when this person is stuck to bed, the happiness that you have from scoring a century, he probably gets that when his parents allows him to watch TV or allows him to take him to a cricket match. We think that sort of relative happiness still factors in. We don't think those scenario is as depressing as you painted. We think those relative happinesses factor in to a large extent, something they mischaracterized. And the worst thing that they did was they said that it was tough for the parents and all of those things as well. We think they're making this assumption based on dehumanization of that individual. What does that mean? It means that anyone who is not fit and can't easily integrate into your society, you'd rather not have those individuals to begin with. That is to say that if these people have certain problems and you as a parent are facing problems, you don't cater to these problems because, well, you know what, it's hard to integrate that person into society. On a comparative, we think if that person was extra genius and was a best engineer in Bangladesh, you as a parent would have extracted certain benefits from it, which means that you have to take that burden as well. If this is a lottery, it means it goes both ways. It's not, that can never be a factor on which to judge this debate. We think that point in time when society makes this decision to sterilize that individual, or that parent makes this decision to sterilize that individual, they only do it because they think from their absolute perspective, the life of that individual is absolutely bad, which is why they think they need to do this to make themselves feel better. That is to say, they do this because they think it's in the best interest of their child. We think this is the biggest problem the society has. We don't think that this person has something that he needs to change to begin with. We think society in and of itself declares him to be a burden, then thinks he's sad because they declared him to be a burden, and decide that he needs to be taken out of the equation. We think society does it to make themselves feel better. We think that is absolutely reprehensible. But before I move on, Shorat Bhai.
Do you agree with the principle that if we can prove to you that that life that individual will potentially have is inherently and absolutely bad, assuming that it is true, we can as a state sterilize that individual?
We're saying that, one, we've shown you why that right to consent that person has is something that you cannot supersede. But secondly, we're showing why the life is not as horrible as you painted to begin with. We're saying that you, from your perspective, have this, the society's view of what happiness is, and you therefore cannot imagine a scenario in which that person is happy. We think society needs to change. They need to open up to the perspective of the people who have these diseases and need to open up to these differences to ever understand the mentalities of these individuals. What does that mean? We think society is non-receptive. A good example of this would be a few years ago, the LGBTQ community was seen to be people with inherent mental disabilities. We think in that world, the LGBTQ people were seen as such because there were not enough people advocating for the fact that this was a natural state of mind to have, that this was something that you inherently did not need to change. We think that was the point in time when individuals thought that since their perspectives, through their perspectives, they could not humanize to that LGBTQ person, there was someone who was not a normal human being to begin with and needed to be delegitimized from society. We think that's absolutely reprehensible. We tell you from our side of the house, we tell you that sure, these individuals do face, say, things like injections, and those parts are horrible. And we do say that in a lot of cases, those things are inherently sufferable things to begin with. But from their side, the debate that they need to win is one, even if all of those things happen, this person has an absolutely bad state of mind and is depressed and his life is not happy. But we are telling you that all of those things could happen to a normal individual as well. One, two, those even if these things happen, their lives aren't as reprehensible as you painted, aren't as depressing as you painted. We think relative happiness still happens on their side. And the point in time when you as society decide to make your prioritization, your perspective the priority, and you allow the, sterilize that individual, we think you as society are doing something that is absolutely reprehensible. We can never stand for this. Very proud to oppose. 7:30.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for his speech. I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the constructive case from the government side. Here, here.
ক্লিয়ার নাকি?
DPM.
হ্যাঁ, এটা শোনা যাচ্ছে?
হ্যাঁ, শোনা যাচ্ছে। আমি টাইম করছি ভাই, ওকে?
Yeah, sure. Awesome. Yeah. Yeah. 3, 2, 1. Happiness, ladies and gentlemen, is not a social construct. The point at which you realize that the harms faced by these individuals are not ones that are mostly dictated by social interactions, but our social interactions are dictated by the sorts of problems that they face. What do I mean by this? On a first level, the harms faced by these individuals are objective in nature. By that, I mean when you require a blood transfusion every 7 days, when you feel weak because you have this disease which does not allow you to properly take food, where you feel weak because your blood cells or your white blood cells are not working properly because of the genetic disease that you particularly have. At that particular point in time, it's not about that happiness anymore. It's about pain, and pain that is objective, biological, and that can hamstring an individual's life in a particularly objective manner. We recognize the fact that the society has not come up with a solution to this, and that in and of itself can be a problem. We can, increase our efforts in terms of research to make sure that we do find solutions to this. However, the harsh reality is that we do not have solutions to this at this moment, which means that we are also not likely to have solutions to this in the near future, because we have been trying to do this for a long time, which means that the individual, and by that they have opposition has accepted the fact that on balance of probability, that person is more likely to inherit this disease, meaning that these individuals will probably inherit this particular disease and then be thrown out in a society where the society does not have a solution to that person's problems. What this brings in is it's not that every other person in the society is out there to make life hard for you, and therefore if you have good people around you, then it will inherently make your life better. It's that to a large extent, if you look at cancer patients and people with terminally people who are terminally ill, we see that it's not so much the people around them that impact, it's not so much the fault of the people around them, but rather their own mentality to a certain extent, mindset is set to a certain extent when they look at the fact that they are having to be constant, their loved ones are having to be constantly aware of the sorts of situations that they face, meaning that a person needs medication or that emergency hospitalization, their relatives are probably will have to be on the watch constantly, meaning that they themselves feel like a burden to the individuals because they see and other individuals who do not have their condition and they live perfectly normal lives, but here you are with that particular condition and everyone has to look out for you constantly, which means that it's not that you cannot go to parties and whatnot, you still go to parties, but then when you are in that party, you're constantly in the fear that something might happen to you at any point in time, and you may jeopardize the entire party, and that party can be ruined just because of you. You have that guilt, not because it was your fault, but you feel that if you did not exist to begin with, this sort of a problem would not happen to anyone else. That's the comparative that they have to deal with. That versus not having that hamstrung life at all. Realize that they tell you the principle of consent, which was never really fleshed out and explained, but I'll tell you why consent does not work here. Understand that your ability to reproduce in and of itself, as we have said from the Prime Minister, is not an absolute or an a priori good, because reproduction in and of itself is just a means to a particular end, meaning that end is that you have a baby has a like good probability of having a, because the society constantly tries to give that person a good life, but when the probability says that that person's likelihood of getting that good life is absolutely in a very minimalistic percentage, and it's more likely than not that that person, as we have already showed to you, will have a bad life at that particular point in time, we don't think consent in this particular way works in this. Furthermore, what increases is to a certain extent the stigma for these individuals. What do I mean by this? So you understand that when these individuals who already have this hereditary disease are allowed to reproduce, and then the offspring that they have also has that particular hereditary disease, to a certain extent there is a sort of social stigma on the parents too as well, by saying that you knew that that child is probably going to be born that way, but you still chose to take that child, meaning that it's not only the child themselves, but it's also the parents to a certain extent who are blamed. And no matter how much they say it's society's fault, social interactions constitute a huge part of your life, which is to say, to a certain extent, this also constitutes a benefit to the parents that the potential parents that we are sterilizing, because then they would not be stigmatized for reproducing and then having children whose lives are objectively worse because of the decision that they particularly made. And then they tell you that like if their situation is so bad, they probably won't take a kid. Understand that having a kid in and of itself, the comparative here is that having a kid in and of itself is something that is an emotional choice rather than a rational choice in a lot of cases. The reason you want to have a kid in a lot of cases is because you think that you'll win that small probability game, and that child that you have will turn out to be healthy and will get all the happiness that you yourself could not get in this particular world. Also because you want to continue your family line and other so many emotional and irrational reasons for having children that people usually have, or because everyone else is having a child, so should you, because that also constitutes your social status. It's not that these individuals understand to a large extent that because they had a bad life, the children are more likely to have a bad life too, and that in and of itself is something that's harmful. Understand that these individuals don't, because of all the irrational reasons that that society in and of itself creates for them, the illusions of having children, and that is why we as a state should step in at that very moment and continue to sterilize them, because that's the sort of that's the sort of society that we live in. But then they'll also tell you about how like there are certain groups of other people who were considered to have mental instability. Understand that we are not talking about mental instability or people with mental health issues. Our conclusion was that if you're born this way, you're more likely and like most likely to have a mental health issue because of the sorts of situation that you're in. I've already described to you why social interaction is so bad because if you have a disease, at that particular point in time, that guilt factor that occurs upon you is more likely to cause that depression, meaning that a lot of people then go into the fact that I would rather not have been born. At that particular point in time, you realize that it's not the parents' consent that matters, it's rather that individual's consent that matters. That's why we see so many people with these diseases going for options like euthanasia, where they voluntarily like decide to end their lives regardless of the fact that their lives regardless of the fact of relative happiness, like opposition would like you to believe. We do not think that that relative happiness is something that a lot of these people are blessed with. In conclusion, we think that if that life is so objectively bad, we'd rather not that life did occur. We'd rather sterilize these parents, but more importantly, we don't think the society is ready to give these individuals a life we're incredibly proud to propose.
I thank the leader, the Deputy Prime Minister, for continuing the constructive case from the government side. I call upon DLO to continue the constructive case from opposition. Here, here. DLO.
Wait. Timer.
I can time.
Yeah, but I want to as well.
Acha, okay.
chill.
আমি তো কিছু বললামও না।
তোর ভয়েস আর কি?
আমার ভয়েস তো তোমার সবচেয়ে খারাপই লাগবে, ধুর।
I was supposed to go have lunch, but I still haven't. So
lunch.
So what? So
lunch at 10:30.
Zayed bhai, are you watching?
No, I'm not.
তাহলে
স্পিচ শুনছিলাম, তা আগে দুটো স্পিচ বেশি শুনে নেই।
হ্যাঁ, ইউটিউব থেকে শুনে নিও। Easy peasy.
Easy peasy. And they're gonna just sit around and wait for me to go and watch all that.
Yes.
Wow.
Just result দিব, কোনো feedback নেই।
Guys. Wait. Uff, এত নোটিফিকেশন আসতেছে কেন? ইন্টারনেট অফ করি।
Popular kids. Sunglass kids.
Okay, shut up. Okay. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. In my speech, I will be giving you two consequential arguments for why we win this debate. But before that, let's go on to direct rebuttals. Starting with first, why, for some reason, the opposition doesn't understand. For some reason, the government doesn't understand why exactly we want consent and why we think consent is such a major issue in this debate. One, the reason that the government side in the first place is not asking for consent is because they know what the reaction will be. The reason they never even gave us the exclusive reason of why they shouldn't want consent. They just tell us that the government needs to intervene to stop that child from being born. We tell you that the reason that the government decided to not take consent here is not because of the fact that they don't want that child to exist, but it's because they're scared of what the parent's reaction will be. The moment you try to ask consent to a person with a hereditary disease and tell him that we want to sterilize you, we don't want you to have kids, we think that most reactions will either be one, okay, fine, sterilize me, and we think those people aren't part of this debate because they don't want kids anyway. But we think the most important stakeholder in this debate are the people who, when they're asked for consent, if they're asked for consent, their immediate reaction is no, because I want kids. What government here does not understand is when exactly does a person want kids? When they feel that they are completely ready to have the kid, right? A simple biology lesson is the fact of a person with an inherited disease could either be a carrier or a person who is affected directly by the disease. We believe that in both cases, what government is doing is sterilizing both the carrier and a person with the disease. A carrier, when he has a child, has a chance of that kid having the disease, and and obviously what the same goes for the other one, but obviously at a higher rate, right? What the government also does not realize is that a child does not have one parent, but it has two parents. So even if one parent has a hereditary disease and the other does not, that means the child's chances of having that hereditary disease are even worse. In my first constructive, I'll be explaining to you later exactly why that we believe that's important, because when a spouse of when the spouse wants a child and realizes that her husband cannot conceive, and the backlash and the reactions that follow in society. And secondly, I will also be talking to you about what the societal impacts are when they find out that there are lots of people in society who have health diseases who cannot conceive, right? Starting with the first one of why exactly we believe that there will be massive backlash when parents find out that they cannot conceive. Think about this. The reason we believe that happiness is subjective is subjective, and that we want the parents to have the chance to have these kids is because one of the biggest or one of the main factors of happiness that a person can have in their life is having a child, right? So when a person thinks that they can have a child and marries their wife and tries to have kids, they believe that they've gone that far in their life because they want to have kids. The moment they try and they realize they can't, and they go to a fertility clinic and see, why can't we have kids? We've been trying for 3, 4, 5 years. They find out that they've been sterilized, right? The immediate reaction to this is, one, the wife who has no hereditary disease will blame the husband, and we believe that will cause a lot of relationship issues, which we don't want in our society. Second problem we feel that happens in the society is that in the future, other people who know that their loved one has a hereditary disease or someone in their family has one, they'll tell others before marriage or before going into relationships that this person probably can't conceive because he's been sterilized, because we assume that at one point in life, everyone will find out that hereditary people with later. We assume that all people with hereditary diseases will know that they can't conceive, right? Because that's the consequences of like 2 generations later down the line, right? When there are less and less hereditary people. That goes on to the second constructive, which is exactly what society will believe when they find out that hereditary diseases-ridden people are less in society, right? In current society, what we see is, Shirley already talked about how there's societal stigma when a parent has a child who with a hereditary disease when they could have prevented it. We believe that that example is even worsened when they try to eradicate these people, because in society, 2 generations down the line, when these people come up with hereditary diseases, they'll be shunned away from society because they'll be said, you're not supposed to be alive because your parents probably got away with not being sterilized, and you were born just because your parents were did something illegal, right? And we believe society in general, when they see anyone with any disease, whether it be hereditary or not, we believe that there will be an automatic greater stigma against them in society, because people themselves will see that that person has a disease. That means they shouldn't be in society, because that is the narrative that government is trying to portray, that you shouldn't be having a life if you're ridden with a disease. They want us to not have kids because that kid could have a bad life. Any person when they're born could have a bad life. Any person that is born could die from suicide. Any person could die from depression. That doesn't mean we don't have kids. That doesn't mean we stop someone from not having kids. That is why exactly we believe that consent is also much more important. Because later, that's also why we believe that consent is much more important, because when you ask for consent and the parent says, fine, I'm okay with it, we see that those people already know that their children could have bad lives. But the ones who don't want, who do not give consent to being sterilized, why are they so important? Is because they want the kids to have their life. And you have to realize that if a person with a hereditary disease is alive to the point where they want to have kids, it means that they're ready for their child to also have that life, even if that child might go through bad issues, right? What the government does not understand here is that when a child is born, when a parent is trying to conceive, he's already gone through these weekly trips to the hospital, or if he has that hereditary disease, like he's still gone to the weekly trips to the hospital. He's gone through depression. He's gone through wanting to later. So he knows that his child could have the same life, yet he's still willing to go through it, even if it's an off chance that his child might not have the disease. We believe they still should have the ability to take that chance, and government at no point has given us exclusive reasons why they want to stop all of these people, carriers or non-hereditary people, to not have these children. Your POI.
If having a child is that important, then A, you can just adopt, or B, you can just have surrogate mothers if genetic continuity is important.
So when we talk
just,
about these, okay. So when we talk about these spouses finding out that their husband can't conceive because because they have some hereditary disease, what the government is in fact doing is not just not allowing you to conceive, but pushing that mother who wants to have children but can't because her husband can't conceive. So they're pushing them to adopt, and we don't see why that is an actual like an option. Because in society, when you're told from childhood that if you marry a person with a hereditary disease, you'll have to adopt a child, it causes a much worse factor in that person's life. Because many wives then will leave relationships because they'll see that that person can't have kids and they don't want to adopt. The government here cannot also, that's just another burden they're creating on themselves, that they want to make sure that everyone who wants a child has to adopt. And we don't believe that that's a burden that they should take. But if they do, we're gladly willing to win that clash as well, right? So in my speech, in Afnan's speech, he gave you the principles of exactly why we believe we need consent and why we need the people with these diseases to still exist in further generations. And I've given you the consequentialist arguments of exactly why we believe there will be massive backlash in society if this motion is passed. I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition. I call upon the government whip to close the constructive case from the government side. Here, here.
Acha, so I need 1 minute to organize my speech.
Okay.
Hello?
Hello.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Sure. Okay.
Ramisha, ভিডিওটা বন্ধ করে দিতে পারো।
Video
মানে
on
if you want,
wait,
মানে ভিডিওটা বন্ধ করে দিতে পারো।
wait. আচ্ছা হ্যাঁ তো। আচ্ছা দাঁড়া একটা সেকেন্ড। All right. So হ্যাঁ অন্তরা শুনতে পারতেছো?
হ্যাঁ শুনতে পারতেছি।
Okay. So 3, 2, 1, start. It's sad that side opposition completely bases their case around what the parents want and what the society wants and what the parents think and what the society thinks. They've completely ignored our case on all the bases we've shown you that this person's life is going to be going to be something that is not worth living. This person's and all the backlashes and all the harms this person is going to face, right? So moving on to my speech. Firstly, what do they tell us? They tell us that look, the person's happiness, this child's happiness and social interactions are something that is relative. So this person who is bind to his bed ultimately derives his happiness from his parents and from people around him. And the happiness that another child could get from playing cricket, they get from their parents. Understand that this assumption falls away when this assumption falls away when we tell you that lives, you ultimately derive and ultimately evaluate the happiness in your life by comparing your life with others. So when you look at your life and see that you're bound to bed, see that you are completely see that you are not being able to integrate in social interactions, or you're not being able to play cricket or not being able to do a particular sport, and when you see and when you compare it with the lives of your, for example, your siblings, or with the lives of your friends, we tell that this is something that ultimately makes you feel that your life ultimately is something that is not worth living. It makes you feel that your life is ultimately not worth living. And this ultimately under this rebuttal, their entire analysis as to how happiness is something relative and social interactions are something that is relative ultimately falls flat. But then they tell us that look, this ultimately leads to dehumanization. So they give us a couple of layers under this, right? So Shabha comes up here and says that, look, so this Shabha comes up here and says that, look, society ultimately, this creates a perception in society that these people don't ultimately deserve to live. So when there is in future a person with hereditary disease, this ultimately this person is shunned away by society. Understand that they understand that their case ultimately surrounds around what society thinks. This ultimately is a prime example of this. We don't sterilize the parents because society believes that they are a burden, because society believes that they're unable to integrate, something that their Elo has talked about. We sterilize the parents because we don't believe that the life that this individual will be living is something that is worth living, and now has on this point clearly shown to you the harms of this, right? So what are the harms, and what are the things that have not engaged us on, right? So we've told you that, look, we are okay with consent, and we are okay with a person reproducing if they don't have any kind of hereditary disease. Why is this the case? Because understand that reproducing as a process to ultimately continue life, right? But when you do reproduce with a hereditary disease, what does this lead to? This leads to you ultimately infringing upon the rights of someone else, right? The right of a child to ultimately enjoy their life, the right of a child to run, the right of a child to lead a normal life. When you as a parent reproduce with having a hereditary disease, and if that hereditary disease does get ultimately transferred to your child, you're infringing upon the rights of the child to live a normal, healthy life. And this is something that we believe is something that is ultimately problematic. So then we tell you that, then they tell us that, look, then the Shabha comes up here and talks about backlash. Says that, look, there's going to be incredible backlash from the society as a whole. We've already tackled this, saying that, look, we don't do it because of society, we do it because of the lives of the child. But secondly, tell us that, look, there are going to be enormous problems in relationship. Understand, they completely disregard what Shrodibha has said in his POI. People can just adopt. And then Shabha makes it sound like adopting is something that is extremely horrible, is something that is extremely horrendous. It is not like adopting mechanisms don't exist. It's not like people don't adopt. We tell you that adopting is ultimately better, because a healthy child who won't be getting a healthy child living in a healthy child who aren't getting fulfilled in life will be able to be more fulfilled if these parents who are completely ready, as Shabha says, adopts these people, which I think is ultimately beneficial for society as a whole, right? But then Shabha comes up and says that, look, gives us a bunch of irrelevant analysis as to how these parents are completely ready. And therefore they should be allowed to reproduce. Understand that Shrodibha has already come up here and given you substantial analysis as to how we can't base the government's decisions to sterilize this person based on whether the parents are ready or not. Because recognize, Shrodibha has already come up here and told us that, look, these parents base their decisions on emotional factors, and also on societal pressures and societal coercions. They base it around as a believes that, look, everyone around me is having children, I deserve to have a child as well, completely disregarding the fact that you will ultimately be infringing upon the rights of another person. They also completely disregard all our analysis as to how Shrodibha has told you that, look, when these parents stop reproducing, you ultimately to some extent remove the stigma from parents as well, right? Because when parents with hereditary disease do reproduce, they ultimately pass on the disease, and this ultimately causes some kind of stigma and social stigma on the parents, because it was ultimately their fault that the parents ultimately that the child is ultimately in this situation today, right? But then they tell us that, look, this child can ultimately be happy, this sadness that this child faces is something that the society is something that comes from the society, right? but is something that comes from the society. It's a societal perception that makes them believe that their lives are not worth living and they're a burden on society as a whole, right? Understand that, recognize that this is something that is not true, right? So when a person is bedridden and all he sees is the four walls of his room and never goes out, right? And ultimately the only time he does go out is for regular weekly visits to the hospital. They realize that the comparison between their lives and someone else's lives is ultimately someone else is living a much better life. They realize that they're ultimately trapped in a room. So we tell you, ultimately, what does this analysis lead to? This shows to you that this perception that they're a burden on society, and ultimately all the harms that Nawal has told you about, the problems that isolation brings about, this doesn't come from societal perception. This comes from within, when they believe that they are ultimately a burden on their parents and they are a burden on society. This happens from social interactions. When they see that they're not able to integrate properly, they take the easy way out, and they ultimately use the leeway to say that society makes them feel that it is their job to integrate. Understand that you cannot get away with this by simply blaming the society, because understand, this is not about society. This is about the person who has the hereditary disease. This person is further dehumanized in the social circles that they have. They feel isolated. They feel isolated, and at the end of the day they feel like taking their lives away, right? So we tell you that Antara, what's the time?
I'm to time koi nahi. I don't think there's a lot of time left. Take 30 seconds and wrap it up.
So summarizing our entire case, right? So what have we told you? We've told you that this person ultimately, even without the consent of parents, are not important. One, because these parents think emotionally, and secondly, because they have societal pressure on them. And secondly, throughout both our speeches, throughout the bench, we've told you that this person's life is something that is going to be horrible. This person's life, they're going to feel isolated. They're going to feel that they're a burden on society and their parents, and they're going to feel that they are never truly a part of society as a whole. We tell you that for all these reasons, we believe that it is better for these parents to be sterilized. And for all these reasons, I'm very proud.
I thank the government whip, and I invite the opposition whip to close the constructive case from the opposition side.
Yeah, I just I need a minute, just a minute. Yeah.
Okay.
Seven-minute speeches, right?
Yes, শুরু করে দিও, হ্যাঁ, এমনিতেই 11টা বাজে।
Okay, sorry. Acha. So starting in 3, 2, 1. Shameful how the only thing they talk about is happiness being an absolute and happiness being based on comparison. If that were so true, I would be depressed because I simply can't debate as good as Shorodip Bhaiya. If I were to compare myself and bring happiness and derive happiness from everything from comparison, people would generally just not be happy. See, the thing you have to notice, speaker, to understand how their case does not stand in this debate is all of their claims are based on complete assumptions they make, right? What are the assumptions they make, the big assumptions? The first assumption they make is that these people who have diseases, their lives are going to be terrible, they're going to go through hell, and the only people that are going to we're talking about in these debates are people who are bedridden. Responses to that, right? First thing, it's not necessarily true that the lives of these people are going to be this bad, right? We've shown to you throughout our 3 speeches how these lives that they talk about are not that dire. The diseases are not, their lives aren't completely bedridden. And we've also told you how even if that were true, the simple the subjectiveness of happiness and how happiness is so relative is something that hasn't been contested properly in this debate, because all the response they have to it is that you compare everything, which is not true. We've shown to you how, right? The second assumption they make is that somehow by taking this, hello?
Yes, continue. Arshi, continue.
She left the call. That was weird.
That was weird. What?
Wait, getting her back.
Stopwatch off कर. Perfume regret. La 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 la.
Hello?
Yes, Arshi.
Oh, it does.
So sorry, my internet screwed up. Asha, so I was at 2 minutes. I paused the timer. I'll continue from there.
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
Sure.
okay.
You can turn your camera off if you want. Yeah.
So,
Do you want to know where you were?
I know. Asha, just a sec. So the thing they don't contest at all is the thing we talk about consent and how very important consent is in this very debate, right? We've shown you how the impacts of consent work. Like, we've shown you how it would affect future relationships these people have. We've shown you how the impact that the importance of consent has in this debate is something that they've ignored throughout their speeches, right? They've all the response that Shorodeb Bhaiya has is that this consent isn't as needed because somehow we have to prove how these lives that are going to be extremely bad according to them is something that should be that people should live, right? We've shown you throughout our speeches how even if we buy their characterization of these bad lives, how the very essence of life itself and how the government or anyone else does not have the inherent right to make this life-altering decision of one person. The taking away the right of consent is so that the power does not exist with someone else. We've shown you how taking away this right to consent, right to consent means that you're devaluing these people, right? We've clearly shown you how consent is very important, and we show you how even in those situations, this consent argument is something we win, right? Moving on. They talk about societal burdens and whatnot, right? They talk about how there's already a stigma, and since their lives are so depressing, they shouldn't be here, and society considers them as a burden, right? The response to that, we've told you down the bench that the reason why they perceive them not to be able to integrate into society is because society itself considers them a burden. Why does this matter? Because why and how it happens is the point in time when you take away the right to consent to such a huge decision in a person's life and you sterilize them, that's the point in time when you say that you yourself are a burden and you do not have the right to reproduce further. That's the point in time when you impose this sense of being a burden on these individuals, and that's very detrimental because that's the point in time when you devalue these individuals and you take away their right of you devalue them as human beings, and you send out the narrative that, you know what, if you're sick you just can't have kids, and that's very detrimental because we've shown you throughout our speeches that inherently means anyone, you send the narrative that anyone who cannot reproduce or who is sick is someone who cannot easily integrate with people. Yeah, before I move on, yeah, go on. Yeah, POI, you're POI.
Yeah, like if life potentially is that important, then why do we allow procedures like abortion that does potentially end a life?
Arshi, are you there? Arshi, you are not audible.
Okay, internet আবার what?
আবার কল ছেড়ে চলে গেছে।
হ্যাঁ, Arshi's internet.
This is what happens when you live in Uttara, na? You need to live in Dhaka city.
I'm getting her back. Let's see what she is.
এই আমার ফিডব্যাক কিন্তু অনেক সাবস্টেনশিয়াল হবে না, ঠিক আছে? ডিল উইথ ইট।
Timer কোথায়? What's the timer at?
হ্যাঁ।
Andra.
হ্যাঁ।
What's the timer at?
Like there are like 45 seconds left.
Okay. Sure, when she comes back, say your POI again and let her answer. Then start the timer with 45 seconds left.
I guess. Fine. বেচারি উত্তরটা ইন্টারনেটে প্যারা খেয়ে
এই কি হইছে?
She's not even online now. Do we just end?
না না না, ও যদি মানে if she's মানে we need to at least like tell her নাহলে মানে ওকে না জানায় এন্ড করে দিলাম, what does that look like?
নাম্বার আছে
doesn't look like anything bros, তো সামান যেতে হয়। 45 seconds.
আচ্ছা ঠিক, মানে আমার কোনো সমস্যা না, I don't think that
last 45 seconds won't change the debate.
আচ্ছা ঠিক আছে, tell her that she had like too little time for it to make any difference and that the debate has ended.
Wow.
Okay.
Are you saying Arshi doesn't make a difference?
20 to 30 seconds. পুরা ডিবেটটা যা হইছে,
That also means that POI doesn't matter.
Stop in the broadcast.